Hello, everyone, and welcome. Rishi backstage just asked as we were coming on, who's the interviewee? And Michelle looked rather relieved to go, me. I'm the interviewee. Michelle, you're about to get a masterclass in long, rambling questions that aren't necessarily obviously questions.
I feel relatively safe in your hands, James.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for being here. I appreciate we're having a morning in the spirit of KITE, which is trying to make sure we reach for ideas or stories that we might not otherwise have heard. And I have to start by saying this. As you can tell, Michelle and I work together at the BBC. We're friends. I said to her, would you come and talk at KITE about your book? And then, of course, what I thought is, well, if she's kind enough to come, I should probably actually read it. And so I read it. It's called Broken Threads, and I was completely floored by it. I was completely floored. I was just saying to Michelle, I just didn't see it coming, and I found myself sobbing, in just taken apart by the story, partly because it's such a personal one. It starts, I'm not going to give the game away, but I'm going to give a bit of the game away with this story that is just so romantic. You know, one grandfather meets the grandmother Mumtaz and sees Mary. I think he describes in his diary these flirtish eyes. Flirtish, I think, might be my new favorite word. There's a wonderful description as Michelle's other grandparents, Shahid and Tahira, that Shahid's obviously a bit slow in getting his life together, and the sisters and the family are cajoling him along. And the description that is given of your grandmother, this, steadfast, good woman, I think described as the best woman in the country. It's just so romantic. I mean, you must have loved it, that bit of the love story as it started.
Well, it's strange because I started thinking about this book. In a way, I started thinking about it years ago, but I wasn't sure I was brave enough to really go there, because there are many pitfalls in writing about your family, and people fictionalize writing about their family, often for very understandable reasons. But because I knew that there was a really important historical story to tell, I thought this has to be a true story. And what started with thinking, okay, my 4 grandparents were part of a generation that were born into the British Raj at a time in the early part of the 20th century when I don't think until probably sometime during the Second World War would they have thought that the British Empire was ending in their lifetimes. And that was partly because all the physical infrastructure they could see. They were growing up at a time when Lutyens's New Delhi was still being built as the grand new capital of British India, taking over from Calcutta. And it wasn't even inaugurated until 1931. And therefore, I was curious to think, okay, so this massive, the South Asian version of the massive 20th century shift from empire to nation state completely shapes not only their lives, but their children's lives. So my parents were born Indian, became Pakistani, and later became British. And of course, it's shaped my life and my identity too. So this was my effort to get to grips with the decisions they had made. And I ended up hoping that the portraits of these 4 people and their life and times is an entry point into a period of history that, even amongst the South Asian diaspora and even in South Asia, is not very well understood. In South Asia, that's partly because there are lots of narratives about nationalism and faith and identity that are rolled into it. But even here, I feel if people like me don't tell our stories and don't understand our own history, how do we expect anyone else to understand the influences and the pressures that shaped our elders and therefore shaped us?
And it's interesting, so, a friend of ours, Danny Finkelstein, wrote this book, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, this personal story that tells you the story of the 20th century. And your family, these 2 sets of grandparents, do the same, tell you the same, the story of India and Pakistan, and to a certain extent the UK. And I just wanted to ask Michelle just to read a section. There was a section, just as we were upstairs, I said, look, would you read this section? Because there's it'll sound strange perhaps, but I was reading it, and suddenly this passage comes along, and I just burst into tears. And I want Michelle to read it and then talk about all the things that it means.
So I'll set the scene a bit, because this comes quite far into the story. But essentially, Shahid and Tyra, who are my maternal grandparents, they came from the area of India, the Gangetic Plain, essentially, from Lucknow and Aligarh. They were very much rooted in that part of North India. They left that part of India behind when they came to Pakistan. And by August 1947, Shahid, who was a serving army officer and had been working for Claude Auchinleck, the last British commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, the pre-independence Indian Army. He had already left to go to Pakistan to take up a new post in the Pakistan Army. But his wife, my grandmother Tyra, was up in Simla in the hills getting away from the heat. And she had had a very difficult journey back down to Delhi because places in India started to become extremely unsafe. There were reprisals against Muslims for what was happening to Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan. So it was difficult for minority communities right across South Asia. So she'd come to Delhi, and she is just about to leave for Pakistan. And there was a young colleague of my grandfather's, Shahid, called Govind Singh, a young Hindu officer, and who was really, really very fond of my grandmother and her then 3 children. And so this is what happened in the last few days. He had already basically saved her life by escorting her from Simla to Delhi. And then this part comes. Departure, this means Tyra's departure from India, was set for the 23rd of September 1947. And in the final days, Tyra had an extraordinary gesture from Govind. He came and presented her with a box, my Uncle Hassan told me. He said it was a gift, something for the children. It was large, about 8 inches long and 3 inches wide, and when she opened it, she found it was filled with jewels. Govind was related to the royal family of Jaipur, and such a treasure had to be part of his inheritance, Tyra thought. The children will grow up, he said. There will be marriages, and you are not rich people. You will need this. She was floored. Their lives had been intertwined for the past 18 months through the bond of Auchinleck's circle, but the extent of Govind's love and generosity on the brink of their departure was now at a different level. Gomji, I can't accept this, she said. For a while he persisted, telling her the jewels were his own, not the property of the state of Jaipur. These are my personal items, and I'm giving them to you for the children. She did not take the box, and from the early 1950s, it was no longer possible to keep in touch, even by letter. Such contact between military families was suspect on either side of the border. But when Govind heard of Shahid's death in 1993, he wrote to Tyra in Rawalpindi, and I remember the letter being passed to each one of us to read. We knew how much it meant to her. 40 years had passed, but they had not forgotten each other.
I find it so moving, Mishal, because this idea of these friendships, and by the way, just in the paragraph before that, Auchinleck says to Mishal's grandmother, I will take you to Rawalpindi. You know, I may be the most senior British general, but I can see the bloodshed in Pakistan, in India, and I've got a duty to the man who worked with me, Shahid, your grandfather. And just the sense that this was a time when people could see politics and states, not ripping countries apart, but relationships and friendships and those bonds, those, as you described them, broken threads. The strength of those threads is overwhelming. I just wonder where you end up, what you end up thinking, not least of the British partition of India.
You see, I really wanted to get away from the narrative that surrounds this period of time, which is essentially the British left and the Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs fell upon each other and massacred each other wherever they could. And if this did happen in some places and in some periods, but there is a much wider story which is about the social fabric through which communities related to each other, and also how they related to the British, because it was a racially hierarchical system and the British were at the top of the tree, even though there was a process after the First World War of Indianization, which both my grandfathers benefited from, where essentially places are opened up in the civil service and in the officer ranks of the army, and there's an understanding that native Indians need to have opportunities to progress. So I think what I was really conscious of was that there was a whole before and after the really seismic events of August 1947. And I knew that my grandparents, I can't say for sure whether they regretted their decision to opt for Pakistan over India, but I know that they lived with tremendous loss, and that was not only separation from siblings. I remember my grandmother Tahira struggles to keep in touch with her beloved younger brother in India, and how, you know, later on in her life, when she can afford it, I remember once, you know, towards the end of her life, she was here in London and she sent him a ticket to come from India to London to meet her. But, you know, these were even your bonds with your own siblings, if you don't have the opportunity to meet, those start to fray as well. So I did want to paint a full picture of the social fabric, and also just how, I mean, imagine in this country, we would call this generation the wartime generation, and certainly my family on both sides, they were forces families. My father's father was a medic through the Second World War, and my mother's father, Shahid, fought in Burma at a really horrendous time, just as the retreat was happening. Some of what he put in his diary of the time was so horrendous, I had to, when I thought, I've got to fact check all of this, could it really have been that, you know, British power is crumbling this fast in the face of the Japanese advance? And it all checked out, the massive scramble and the retreat from Burma. But yeah, I just felt I wanted to paint a broad canvas. And actually that canvas is not only about India. That canvas from the end of the First World War, just like we are influenced by and affected by events today in the Middle East or wherever else in the world, families like mine were watching the end of the First World War, and they were seeing the creation of lines in the sand and new countries being born in Europe and in the Middle East, the end of the Ottoman Empire. And they were drawing lessons from all of this. What should we be demanding? At that time, the demand in India was largely Swaraj, self-rule, not Azadi, independence. And so this period of time really develops and culminates in 1947, but it is very affected by the First and the Second World Wars. And I think overall the conclusion I came to is that Britain was always behind overall what the demand in India was. So what really, India should have been a self-governing dominion like Canada and Australia, but it wasn't, and that's probably because, you know, the Indian political class were Indian. They were not white.
And all the way through the book, there are these sort of extraordinary little moments. You know, one of your grandfather's friends from school ends up marrying Stalin's daughter. You know,
that one I also had to fact check, and it also checked out. At one point he says, a school friend of mine married Svetlana Stalin, and I was like, what? And yeah, whether they were married, you know, legally, I don't know, but yes, this is true, and it's in the book.
But one of the things about it, Mishal, of course, and it's the curiosity, isn't it, of very, very personal stories hitting huge political narratives. But in one sense, you're particularly lucky in that your grandfather, as you say, worked for Auchinleck and also kept a diary, a memoir, which means in that really critical phase, 46, 47, he's in the room as Britain is making a decision about how to decide the fate of India. And it seems to me as though you come to quite a view on the speed at which that process happens and potentially the really historic mistakes that are made.
Yes, and that was, it was hard because in some ways I wanted to keep the story quite narrow and personal. And then I found this book, as it progressed, getting more and more political and deeper into the history. And there were times when I felt that quite overwhelming because this is complex and there are many communities and, you know, personalities. But I thought I have to get to grips with all of this in order to understand it. This has to be as historically accurate a book as is possible while still written from a particular family perspective. But Shahid was the private secretary to Field Marshal Auchinleck, who, I think one of the things that really upset my grandfather was that this country had forgotten Claude Auchinleck. And the reason he felt that was partly about India and Pakistan, but also about Auchinleck's service in the Second World War. He was later referred to privately by Churchill as the greatest general that Britain had in the Second World War. And the reason Churchill thought that was because in 1942, as Rommel and his Africa Corps were sweeping right across North Africa, Auchinleck was the first one to stop that advance. It was at the first Battle of El Alamein in the summer of 1942. He and Churchill then clashed over how fast to advance and to properly push Rommel back. And he was replaced, Montgomery came in, and essentially the second battle of El Alamein that autumn is the one everyone remembers, and Montgomery claimed all the credit. So by the time that Shahid and Tahrir met Auchinleck in 1946, you know, he was, as far as they were concerned, and I think as far as anyone should be concerned, he was a great war hero that they were, well, Shahid was working for, and Tahrir knew him personally. He had had a crisis in his personal life. His wife had left him for another senior officer in Delhi. It was a scandal of the time. And I came to the conclusion that great men really, the ones we think of as great men today, it is often because they have worked hard to establish that image in all of our eyes. They've written their memoirs, they've had their proxies out there telling their story, they have made sure that their version of events is there. And Auchinleck didn't do any of that. He didn't accept a peerage, and so really I think his rightful place among that, you know, panoply of great British wartime generals was lost. And when Shahid worked for him, he said to him, Auk, which is what they called him, Auk, can I keep the papers? Can I keep copies of the papers that cross your desk? And he said, yes, you can. And you can write about me if you like, but you can't do it until after I die. Shahid thought, fine, you know, I mean, he obviously didn't want his old boss to die, but he also, I think, didn't anticipate he would live until 1981. So Auchinleck was the last of his generation, and when my grandfather published his Partition diary in 1986, it wasn't terribly well received here. And I think that's because it was seen as a partial account, the account of a Pakistani. And now, I think, 40 years on, we have much more of a sense of what Shahid said at the time, which was, real history only emerges when we take everyone's point of view into account. I don't think Britain was ready for that in the 1980s.
And it's interesting because in the account that you give of Auchinleck, also, you know, he takes on racism. It's interesting when you talk about great men. Actually, one of the things that's so striking about him is his sensitivity to the individuals around him, his care for the individuals. But the reason I just want to go back on this point about partition and what happened in 46, 47, is that it seems in reading the book, Mishal, that you're saying there was a moment, and more than a moment, when it seemed obvious that the UK was looking for Indian independence, but not partition. And then suddenly Mountbatten's out there, and Britain's in a tearing hurry to hand India over, and partition becomes the means of doing that, i.e. there was a haste to what happened, yes, and the consequences were deadly.
And I think those who, Mountbatten and his circle would say that the reason the haste was happening was because communal violence was getting so bad, and this was seen as a way to give India what it wanted and essentially stem the violence that way. But I think the leaving of a colony is as important as the governing of it. And as I look back, there's this crucial moment in 1946 where Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister, sent Stafford Cripps, who had worked on India during the war as well, and sent him as part of a trio, as a mission from the cabinet to Delhi to essentially work out how can we transfer power from Britain to India. And Stafford Cripps spent weeks talking to all the parties and making his own assessment, and the conclusion was that he could not recommend India being divided. It was too complex in terms of assets, in terms of language and regions, and communities were too mixed. And instead, he proposed a union of British India and the princely states, of which there were 500, including the big ones, Kashmir, most importantly, probably in this context. And then there was an idea that provinces, if they felt particularly strongly on certain issues, could group together. And the idea was that, you know, this gave the Muslims something, because Muslim majority provinces could group together if there was something in particular being passed by the central government which they felt affected them. So this was the plan. And to some extent, the parties agreed to it. The Muslim League, led by Jinnah, agreed to it. Congress agreed to it. And then there was a sort of slight unraveling or questioning of that position. And essentially, I look at this and think probably the lesson of that time was to stick to that plan. But instead, communal violence did begin and was very, very bad in some places. And by February 1947, the position of the British government is, okay, now instead we are going to, they don't disown the cabinet mission plan, but they do say, we are going to hand over power into responsible Indian hands, whatever that means, by June 1948. That's the definite date. And Auchinleck and other British officials in India were very, very dismayed by this, because they said, where's the incentive now for the parties to agree to the cabinet mission plan? You've essentially told them, dig in, stick to what you're doing, doesn't really matter, because if you dig in June 1948, power comes to you anyway. So I think that as someone now who spends so much time talking to politicians and questioning politicians and the exercise of power, I look at this particular policy and think, it doesn't really stand the test of time.
So I want to ask you a bit about you and this book. So I'm Jewish. I have a family that I think stands kind of at my shoulder, the history of it all. If you go home to my home, my grandmother's old typewriter sits next to my desk. She wanted to be a journalist. You know, in the 30s, one of the first things the Nazis did, our family were German Jews and fled in the 30s, but one of the first things they did was to remove the right for Jews to work in journalism. And when I was reading your book, I was thinking about this. I was thinking, what do we choose of the stories of our parents and grandparents to define ourselves? Because they're not necessarily the defining elements of their lives. They're things that we choose to, in some ways, justify or explain ourselves. And so I was wondering, Mishal, in terms of those four grandparents, what do you choose?
Well, I think one of the things I'm really struck by is that in the beginning of the 20th century, in the period that my grandparents are born, three of them are Muslim, one of them, Mary, is an Anglo-Indian, i.e. mixed race Catholic from the southeast of India. But my three Muslim grandparents, they were really part of, there was so much of their time which was, where their sense of being Muslim is not, I don't know if this is going to sound odd, or maybe you can relate to this. It's, of course, part of their identity is about faith, but that is sort of very much wrapped up in community rather than religion. That it is a sense of, they are very conscious that there isn't really a Muslim middle class at that point, that people aren't educated enough, that the Hindu community is progressing fast in business and in education, and they very much feel that, you know, that they look to someone like Jinnah, who is the most successful lawyer in British India, who is very progressive, whose sisters are not in parda and veiled or anything like that. And they see him as embodying what they want for their families. They want education and empowerment and social mobility. And so a couple of generations back, where one of my great-grandfathers is a tailor, a generation later his son is a doctor, all of this is happening. So I think that I realized that that desire to progress in the world is so important. They realized that the old order, the Mughal Empire, which was an empire of Muslim rulers, that is gone. The old world is gone, and they're very conscious of that self-improvement is part of what you do individually, and then that raises the whole community up. So they're really driven by that, and I think that is probably a part of my life, in that I've always thought of myself as the daughter of an immigrant, although finding my grandfather Shahid's 1931 passport, which records his nationality as British subject by birth, I now think, okay, after writing this book, I think I'm the granddaughter of British subjects. Maybe that's slightly different to being the daughter of an immigrant. But I think that desire to do the best job you can, that there's no, in a way, there's no rest. There's no, you have to do justice to the sacrifices that your elders made, and you have to, you have to keep trying your hardest. And I think there's an insecurity probably that remains as part of that.
Interesting. They were very, very hardworking people, your grandparents. They also, it seems, were determined to succeed regardless of place. And, sitting here with you, I'm struck by the fact that many people would find it fascinating that your history reaches so obviously into India and Pakistan, and you talk about your family's home, back in Rawalpindi, and yet at the same time, I think many people would say, if you were to think about who sort of embodies what it is to be British in 2024, they'd say, oh, Mishal Husain. And so I wonder how those two things square with you.
Yes, it's interesting because when I look back on this, of course, this is a very personal book, but I realized that because I was born in this country, and then I grew up in the Middle East because my father went to work in the UAE as a doctor, and he developed a specialism in tropical urology. And I think that when I then came to school here, because by then my parents were living in Saudi Arabia and there were no decent schools, at least their concept of decent for girls at that time, and I was sent to boarding school here, which was, I think, quite a defining experience in that it made me very independent from quite a young age. And I think that but I definitely felt I had no history of my own, because even when I went to visit my grandparents, my maternal grandparents in Rawalpindi, I knew that it wasn't where they came from. I knew that these weren't the streets that they grew up in. Weirdly, even as a child, I knew, okay, the streets where they grew up in are in these places, Lucknow and Aligarh. I know they're geographically close, but for some reason, no one can ever go to these places. And yet I hear about them all the time. The reason that we address people in a certain way, I didn't call my grandmother the Urdu or Punjabi version of granny, which would be Nani. I called her Achhi Ammi, which meant the good mother. We had all these kinds of titles rather than just colloquial names for people in our family. It was like, it's quite hard to describe in English, but you might have the lady aunt, Khala Bibi, or you might have the Nani Begum, or, there'd be all these kinds of quite almost honorific style titles for members in your family. There was a lot of, there was just a certain way that you addressed people, which was drilled into me. And I knew that that was because of the culture that my grandparents came from, but it was not rooted in where they were living now. So I had all of this sense of dislocation. But I think, yes, I've acquired, I was always brought up in English and in Urdu, but now English is obviously much more dominant as a language, and I've forgotten a lot of my Urdu. But all of these are parts of my life, and yeah.
Listening to you, it's also striking. They work hard, your family. I mean, every single member of them in different ways. Mary shows up, she trains to be a nurse, but not quite, then ends up teaching. Mumtaz, a doctor. What's your relationship with work?
Well, I think that, there is something, I think I am really driven, and I think that is because I would have loved to go to university to read English. That would have been my great passion. I knew I couldn't even ask my parents to do that because they would have been like, what are you going to do with a degree like that? I mean, I don't know. Yeah. It's like but look, one of my sons is doing theology at university, and when, my aunts and uncles were like, I'm sorry, he's doing what? What on earth is he going to do with that? And I said, times have changed. We let our children do what they want now. I know I wasn't brought up like that, but that's what it's like now. But so I guess.
What did you study?
I did law. Because I felt I had to do a vocational degree, and halfway through doing law, it was one of, and then I thought, actually, I'm not going to be a lawyer, and I went off and did some work experience at the BBC, and then I remember I had to sort of break it to my parents. My father, in particular, was a very exacting man, and I had to say, okay, I think I'm going to do journalism, and he's like, how on earth are you going to earn a living in journalism? Which remains a good question. But years later, we did the relative values column for the Sunday Times together, where you're both interviewed separately. And it was like we managed to separately have the conversation, which we had not managed together to that point or subsequently, which was that I said he did not support me really going into journalism. And he admitted that he thought it was a terrible idea, but it had worked out all right in the end.
Not too disappointed.
Not in the end. He's like, but I do think I pretty much had to appear on international television before my parents thought that journalism was an okay route to have gone down.
Can I ask you about that, about news? You say, I now spend quite a bit of time interviewing politicians and powerful people. How has the book changed your view of the news? We both have worked in a world where one of the criticisms and complaints is we're so focused on the 24-hour cycle, we're missing the trends and developments that happen. How often do you find yourself in the studio thinking, what are we talking about?
Well, I think it is hard when you work in daily news to stand back and look at the bigger picture and think the thing that we think is the most important and the most pressing thing today, the thing that's at the top of our running order. And I love the way you talk about this in your news meetings at Tortoise. Yeah, sometimes I realize that in writing this book, our history is the news and current affairs of my grandparents' times. And I realized that even without mass media, of course they were deeply affected by what they were hearing in other parts of the world. I know that they were deeply affected in the 1930s at knowing what was discrimination that was coming in Nazi Germany for Jews, and drawing their own lessons and, wondering what that meant for minority communities elsewhere. I know, for example, that 1857, when there was a mutiny and an uprising, often now called in South Asia the First War of Independence, part of the reason Britain was determined to crush that uprising was because they were thinking, what if the Maoris do the same? Or what if the Irish do the same? All of these, people are drawing, individuals and governments are drawing implications all the time with, if we allow this, what does this mean? So I think I am somewhere in the back of my mind, I am always conscious, like the news and breaking news can be like the runaway train of the time. You have to follow the news as it's going. But of course there's a danger that you're not stepping back enough and thinking, well, how is history going to judge this moment?
And by contrast, Michelle, what about the history is no guide argument? So one of the things that is live at the moment is in relation to the Middle East and the argument about a two-state solution, Israel-Palestine. You'll have heard people say, no, look at the example of India and Pakistan. Actually, dividing territory isn't necessarily the way in which you create a long-term stability and peace.
Yeah, and I don't think it's only India and Pakistan. You can look at all the way that the Ottoman Empire was carved up and the arbitrary way that those lines were drawn. And I think none of that reflects well on the imperial powers of the time. I don't know if I can answer that. I generally don't, but I think I can say that I think I'm not always sure there are lessons from history, but what I really wanted to do was to feel, I really had a strong feeling that the way that these events between the wars and between 1945 and 1947 played out in India and the creation of Pakistan, I do think that these events deserve to be better known, that we should understand the exercise of British power, and indeed, I think, how it affected subsequent immigration to this country. Because I do wonder, a lot of the people look at Punjab was in 1947 one of the worst hit provinces in terms of areas, in terms of violence. And I think that's also the province from which in the 1950s and 60s there was much of the migration to this country. So I think when you're displaced once, you often end up being displaced again. Maybe once you were forced to flee, once as a choice, but you are less rooted, I think, in your home territory. So I think there are many ongoing sort of repercussions and consequences from the times I write about.
So I want to make sure that we can get questions and views in the room, and if it's possible just to bring the lights up a bit, that would be great. And before we do that, I have one further question. Sleep. When do you do that?
Well, I think I've spent enough time on today now to have my own routine surrounding that. So in the exciting life I lead, tonight I'll be in my pajamas at 8 for sure, and the alarm goes off at 3. But I can make that work in the sense that I just can't burn the candle at both ends. So there are, if for some reason I, don't get to sleep, this is rare, but if I don't get to sleep till 10, I really feel it the next morning. But
and then do you come back and go to sleep?
No, I used to when I had young children because then otherwise I found that after I picked them up from school, I was really grumpy between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and when they went to bed. So I had to have a nap. But as they and I remember one of my sons saying, "Oh yeah, one of my teachers was asking me, how does your mother manage it?" And I told them, "You have lots of naps." So
That did.
But actually no, now it's different. But to write this book, I found myself often on off-air days. I would get up at not 3, not 4, but I would get up at about 5, and I would use that very quiet that time when the world is very still and silent around you. I found that quite mind-focusing. And often I would wake up and I would realize that I'd been dreaming about the 1920s and non-cooperation and Gandhi and Jinnah, or I'd be in Burma in the Second World War. And then I'd realize, okay, this book is finally coming together because I'm living those times.
Questions, thoughts? Anyone? Yes, there's a gentleman and a lady there, sir, and there's one right in front of you. Yes.
Thank you, Michelle.
Would you say your name?
Oh, sorry, Patrick Bradley.
Patrick.
I was on the board of the National Army Museum during the centenary celebrations for the First World War, and one of the things we were trying to do was to tie the thread of history for kids in this country, particularly of Indian and Pakistani heritage, to understand that the vast contribution of the Indian Army during both World Wars should not be forgotten, and Britain's freedom was very much contributed by what they did. But I'd be quite interested in your view about how we tie threads, because just having come back from India recently, certainly Modi's position on history, particularly the contribution of the Indian Army, is that they were mercenaries, colonial, sort of lackeys of the colonialists, not something to be celebrated. So in your view, how do we in Britain tie that thread of history?
I think that the Indian Army's contribution in the two world wars is much easier to talk about in Pakistan than it is in India, and where I think the perception is much more, yes, this was our contribution, and we were on the right side of history. It's nevertheless, there are complexities, and I think that was one of the. I touch on this in the book, but I really feel it's another whole book. I don't know if it's a book for me or someone else, but there is this whole group of thousands of Indians who did go over to the Japanese as they were fighting in Southeast Asia during the Second World War, and particularly this period in 1942 when the Japanese are advancing very, very fast after Pearl Harbor. And that is very, very complex. And my grandfather Shahid took the view that, these fellow Indians were beyond the pale. But I realized that it's a lot more complex. There were many British officers who, when these men were brought back to India as prisoners of war in 1945, said to Auchinleck, these men are no different than any British person who went over to the Nazis. And Auchinleck actually says to them, I don't think it's the same, that there's a whole context in which these men were not disloyal until the opportunity presented itself. In some cases, they were under duress. In other cases, the Japanese very effectively said to them, what are you doing fighting for the British when they haven't given you your freedom in India, and when you face discrimination in the officers' messes and your wives face discrimination from the British officers' wives? And so I think that is a very complex aspect of all of this. And actually, after independence, in Pakistan, those men of the Indian National Army, as it was called, didn't really get the time of day. But in India, it was different. They were much more seen as people who were fighting for the cause of independence almost before the rest of the country woke up to it. So I think the legacy is slightly different in those two places. But I think for us, South Asians, the South Asian community in Britain today, I think this is an immense opportunity for togetherness and understanding and shared recognition of sacrifice. And my late father, the last project he had before he died was that there should be a memorial to Muslim soldiers who served in the two world wars. There is one to Sikhs already. And so perhaps a project like that is something that helps emphasize the bonds between us.
Other thoughts or questions?
Hi, my name is Ellen. I'm going to pick up your book, for a friend of mine who was a young American woman at Berkeley in the 60s, and she married a young Indian man, not knowing anything about his family, whatever. And then they moved for some reason to Texas. And because he was the son who was granted the brains, he was expected to then bring over everybody in his family to, unfortunately, Texas, where all of the neighbors thought they were Mexican because they had dark skin. And she tells me these stories of the family And those years there, and how she was supposed to be a good Indian wife, but she was a girl from Berkeley, and the whole thing just makes so little sense to me. And I think back as to my own education about, so I was born in 1950, so going to school, part of my life I lived as a young student in Toronto, then we moved back to Brooklyn where my whole family is. And during that period of time, up until like 1960-something, the world was changing drastically and borders were disappearing and colonies in Africa and around the world were all of a sudden becoming countries. And I remember this vividly because it was happening and we talked about it, but we didn't learn about it, and my children really never learned about it. And that's where I leave. It's not really a question, but it's, so where are we now in terms of understanding these mass migrations that all of us are the product of?
Well, I think we're in a better place in terms of, I think we're much more questioning now the sort of narrative of, there's much more questioning around the idea of empire, but I think that the way that, what my book is really about is the way that the big history, if you like, was experienced by individual families. And I don't just mean my family. I mean that I think what I've written about will resonate with many families of similar heritage, but I think, as you suggest, with people who know that there's dislocation and disruption of different kinds in their own families elsewhere in the world. And I think the other thing that's really healthy is the whole, I know DNA testing is part of this, but so many people are digging into their own ancestry. And when people say to me, oh, you were lucky, you had sources. And I did have sources, okay? One of my grandfathers wrote books and kept a partition diary. Another one left an unpublished memoir. And what I loved about that, this is my grandfather Mumtaz, is he recorded the daily life of his home, how it was a very simple conservative Muslim family where they lived very close together. So his aunt is giving birth basically behind a curtain, and life and death and sickness is all part of their daily life in such a dramatic way. But I think I would say to anyone who's thinking about doing something similar, you may think that you have very little to go on, but one thing really does lead to another. So you start with the fragment that you have, the single letter, and then you work out from that. And if you don't know much about the people, you will probably know the place. And you can piece together, well, what was that place like in 1920 or 1930? And what were other people who knew that place saying at the time? And you can, one after another, start to build up a broader picture, which I think does give you more of a sense of yourself.
Can I just pick up on one theme? So this gentleman here, we'll just bring the mic. Can I just ask one question just that follows up on that? Yeah. One question, Michelle, which is, and I don't want to ask it in a sort of annoying kind of inside the BBC way, but it's sort of related. You talk about we're in a better place talking about empire. Of course, I think if we were sitting here 4 or 5 years ago having this conversation just on the back of Edward Colston and arguments about statues, it would feel as though that was much more contested. And also, as you were speaking, I was thinking, when my sister left college, she wrote this lovely paper called Can You Bring Yourself to Work? And it was really about how much you could actually bring yourself to work, how much you could talk about yourself and allow yourself to inform what you were doing and the way you were speaking in the workplace. Now for you, the way you speak in the workplace is the way you speak to all the rest of us over breakfast. So it's quite a big call that, how much you allow the current political arguments over empire to inform the way in which you wrote the book, but vice versa, how much your experience of the book informs the way in which you ask questions at work.
Well, I think there's no doubt that it was quite hard for me to write something as personal as this, because I do believe in not being the story, and therefore there's quite a barrier to overcome. Even when my publisher said, okay, the subtitle should be, I thought it should be A Family from Empire to Independence, and she said, no, I think it should be My Family from Empire to Independence. And I thought, God, that feels like it's really bigging up, me, I'm not very comfortable with this. So there are sort of my own internal barriers I've had to overcome in this, and I really did work very hard in trying to be objective on the politics side of it, in that, I cross-checked things a million times and thought, well, what was happening to other communities, not only the ones that I am connected to through blood. But there are, I mean, most of the time, this doesn't come into my work that much, but I remember a few months ago, I think I was doing an interview with David Lammy well before the election, and he was talking about what Labour's foreign policy was likely to be if elected to government. And I think he was talking about the Attlee government. And as it happens, I know quite a lot about at least this aspect of the Attlee government's foreign policy. And I can't remember the exact question I asked, but I did sort of point out that perhaps the Attlee government's foreign policy wasn't necessarily something which was, to be emulated. And so there are those moments where you're using your knowledge, but I think in that sense, most of the time, it's no different probably than Justin Webb using his long knowledge of America. You just for all of us presenters on our program today, there are going to be stories that we have done more work on for whatever reason, and there's the odd moment where it comes into your work. But most of the time, I see myself as that, I am, for the most part, a generalist, and I feel that everything is interesting once you do some homework on it. I really feel that. You shouldn't ever be looking at an item thinking, oh, that one's going to be really boring. If you're thinking that or saying that, it just means you haven't done enough work on it.
This gentleman here, sir.
Thank you. I'm delighted about the optimism about how we are learning from history about where we've all come from and the positivity that brings. But at the same time, I think we are in a very dark place in terms of the wider question around our attitudes to migration. And I think we had an excellent example of how terribly this is playing out in the post-truth world of politics yesterday when James was interviewing Philippe Sands about the Chagos Islands, and we had this little discussion about how the Conservative Party leaders have gone from saying black is white. They were all in favor of the negotiations, and they've now all come out saying this Labour government has done something terrible. So as a journalist, where you sit on the Today programme, how do we move to a better place in having the conversation about the need for migration when it has come to dominate politics so unbelievably horribly, particularly in the last election campaign?
Okay. I think that, there are moments when, for sure, there are moments about the kinds of really difficult times that I write about. There are moments where that comes back to me in a graphic way when I'm sitting in that chair live on the Today programme. And I had one of those moments this summer after the riots where one morning we did an interview with a young woman who had been terrified in her house with her mother's car being destroyed outside and fearing that a mob was going to break into their house. And I found myself thinking about exactly what I was writing about. I mean, my four grandparents, I would say, were not refugees in 1947. They made a choice for Pakistan. But other members of their family did flee, and that depended on individual circumstances. My great-grandmother was the head of a household, which was a household completely of women and children, and there was a sequence of events involving the local police coming to their house and sort of sizing up the place and realizing that there were no men in this house and asking some really awkward questions that made them feel, we have no security here, we have to leave while we still can. So I think there are stark moments in the present as well as in the past, and I don't have the answers to the questions you're thinking about, but I think that, there are moments when what I've written about does come back to me in a very immediate way on air.
Also, I suppose, homework, choices about the stories and the way they're covered. And for what it's worth, reading Mishal's book. Because in all seriousness, I think that this is an extraordinary story of a history that certainly I didn't study at school. And it's a story that you end up, I think, Mishal, in a rather hopeful place.
I felt perhaps hopeful. I mean, actually, when I was reading the audiobook, I found the end of the book quite emotional to read because it's saying what happened at the end of my grandparents' lives, and it has these words which perhaps I'll read, which which I found in audio tapes that were left by my grandmother Tyra. This is a woman who left her medical degree to get married, who, so never had a job, saw herself as wife and mother, and I think she had some of the wisest, she was a big, big reader, and she has some of the wisest words, I think, that I think sort of sum up the tone of the book. And so when she recorded these tapes, my grandfather Shahid had just died, and she thought that maybe she would put down something on tape that would turn into a book. And she said, maybe I'll try and recapture our life, the fabulous, happy life that we had, 5 decades of it, she said on tape after she was widowed, although she shied away from the idea of writing history. Partition was a sad, sad era, she concluded. I will not hesitate to say it here, even though this is not meant to be a political book, but it need not have happened had the majority in India accepted ordinary demands from a minority. But it happened, and the way it happened was tragic. And to the eternal shame of the people of India and Pakistan, that big tragedy has been followed by others.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mishal Husain.
Thank you so
Mishal,
much, James.
thank you.
Thank you.